Good afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's April post-Brexit clinic at Queen's. As usual, the recording of this session will be available online afterwards, and we'll also share the slide decks from this afternoon's presentations. For any comments or any questions that you might have this afternoon, if you can put it into the chat function, and we'll come back to you once the panelists have made their interventions. And finally, just please do continue to follow us at Queen's on Twitter at QUB Policy, and also on our blog, the qpol.qub.ac.uk. So I'll hand over to David Finnemore now. Thank you and enjoy this afternoon.
Okay, thanks very much, Kevin. Welcome everybody to this latest post-Brexit clinic that we're running this year. As you know, I'm David Finnemore, and I'm going to chair today's event and also say a few opening remarks. We've got a number of presentations today focused on the protocol and where we are with Brexit and the implementation of the protocol. But before we start, can I just draw your attention to the context in which this is being held today. We are now running a project at Queen's on the implementation of the protocol, and just like to draw your attention to the website which we've been launching over the last couple of days, and encourage you to have a look at that so you can keep up to date with what's happening around the implementation of the protocol. The project is sponsored by the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, and on the project we have myself and Katie Hayward, who you all know. We also have Bilimelo Aruju joining us from the School of Law, and Lisa Witten from History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics, and we're going to be working together over the next 3 years, along with other colleagues, including Vivian Gravy, who's with us today as well. Now we're all each going to make a couple of presentations. I'm going to start off with an overview of where we are with Brexit and some of the issues which are ahead in terms of the implementation of the protocol. Billy's then going to take over and talk a little bit about some of the legal actions which are happening around the protocol, and then we're going to hand over to Katie and Lisa to talk through some of the findings of a recent opinion poll that we've carried out on views of voters in Northern Ireland on the protocol and on Brexit. And then Vivian's going to come in at the end and address one of the issues which is raised in that poll, and that was whether, in order to reduce some of the friction on the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, we should be looking at greater regulatory alignment between the UK and the EU. Okay, so we've each got a couple of slides to share. I'll start off. Where are we? Well, we're into the 4th month of real Brexit, 4th month of the implementation of the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement and the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. Okay, I think first point to make there is the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement is still only provisionally in force, because the European Parliament has still not signed off on it, although we expect that to happen at the end of this month. It's a formal requirement for the full entry into force of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and there's been a couple of delays there, partly because of the European Parliament want to ensure effective scrutiny of the agreement. This is the agreement which essentially the UK Parliament took a day to scrutinise. The European Parliament is taking a little bit longer. Okay, we're all very much aware that the events were quite fraught at the beginning of this year with the implementation of the protocol, the tension which existed around the temporary moves of the European Commission to invoke Article 16 and the safeguards, and that's brought about increased opposition to the protocol, evident in the DUP's launch of this Free Us From the Protocol campaign. What we've also seen is some unilateral moves on the part of the UK around the implementation of the protocol, unilaterally extending some of the grace periods and basically not applying certain elements of the protocol. And this has led, as you see there, in March, to the European Commission launching legal action against the UK. And Billy's going to tell us a little bit more about that. Alongside of these developments, you've also got the operation of the institutional framework for the protocol. So the UK-EU Joint Committee met back in February, and the Specialised Committee met in March for the first time of this year. Important there is the sort of change of personnel in terms of the chairing of the Joint Committee. We've moved from Michael Gove representing the UK to David Frost, and some people see in this a shift in approach. David Frost seemed to be a slightly more robust negotiator than possibly Michael Gove is seen at times. We'll see how that plays out. Certainly, it took a while for David Frost and Maroš Šefčovič, the European Union co-chair of the Joint Committee, to meet, but they did last week come together for an informal meeting, at which they identified some of the issues on the agenda between the UK and the EU around the implementation of the protocol, where there's still quite a considerable number of outstanding issues, and those are having to be addressed against a backdrop, as we're probably all very much aware, of a spate of violent protests in Belfast, which, at least in part, had as one of their rationales opposition to the protocol. Okay, so that's where we are. The consent of the European Parliament is still to come. We expect to see that in April. What we're also anticipating is the UK and the EU continuing their dialogue around how do you implement the protocol, and moving towards the adoption of some sort of roadmap to address all the outstanding issues. What form that will take is still to be decided, and that still assumes there will be agreement. But the important thing to note is that the officials are talking. They have identified quite a considerable number of issues. The question now is how do you go about reaching agreement on how those are to be implemented? Okay, we've also got coming up judicial review, which I'm sure Billy will mention. And then just to remind you that it's not just the one grace period at the end of March, which was extended. We've got other grace periods coming to an end during the course of this year. The grace period on the introduction of prohibitions and restrictions on movement of meat products from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, that grace period ends at the 30th of June. We're still not too clear exactly what's going to happen after that. And then the unilaterally extended grace periods of the UK come to an end on the 31st of October. And it's still not clear exactly what's going to happen then. And then, as some of you might have seen in the media recently, the question of what's happening with the application of the EU Medicines Acquis in Northern Ireland has come to the fore because of the difficulties that raises regarding supply chains. There's a current grace period lasting to the end of this year. That formally comes to an end on the 31st of December. And there's various calls for the extension of that to occur as well. So plenty ahead. And then if we're thinking slightly longer term, we've obviously got the future of the protocol, or at least the Articles 5 to 10 of the protocol, because those will be up for vote by MLAs in December 2024. I suppose here what's important is not just that vote in 3.5 years' time, but also what's going to happen in the Assembly elections next year in May, because the likely outcome of that 2024 vote will probably be determined in the Assembly elections in May next year. And as we'll see from the opinion poll findings that we've produced, but also, as you have noted from Spotlight last night, there are obviously clear divisions and quite entrenched positions around the protocol. Okay, so that's a few words of sort of scene setting by me in terms of where we are and what's coming ahead. And I'm sure we'll pick up on some of these issues as we go through the other presentations. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Billy to talk about some of the legal actions.
Hello, everyone. Can you see me and hear me, hopefully?
We can hear you, yes.
Excellent. So I was asked to say a few words about judicial review and legal actions, and then I was told I had 8 minutes to do so. So you'll forgive me if I really just provide you an overview, and of course after I'm done here, I'm happy to field any additional questions on the more detailed issues and procedural mechanics. So can I move the slide, or if we can move the slide? I don't know if someone else can do it for me. Yeah, excellent. So we're a few months into the protocol now, and we've already seen a number of legal challenges relating to the protocol, whether they be legal challenges attacking the protocol itself, or challenges relating to acts which would be somehow in breach of the protocol. So, for example, we've seen the infringement proceedings that the European Union or European Commission recently initiated against the UK for its decision to unilaterally extend the grace periods. But what I wanted to do in the brief time that I have is just to take a step back and give you a broad overview of the various avenues that are available for the judicial reviews relating to the protocol. And I suppose a good place to start here is to understand a crucial distinction here between two broad categories of judicial reviews. There are those that are specifically envisaged in the protocol, in the withdrawal agreement, and those that are generally available under domestic legal systems, under the EU legal system and the UK legal system. Obviously, for the first category, you have a subdistinction between the arbitration procedure, so the state dispute settlement mechanism, which is created in the EU withdrawal agreement, and which is a fairly standard practice in international treaties, and especially in trade agreements, where you have a dispute settlement mechanism, which is only made available to the parties that are signed on to that treaty, which of course means that private applicants, so natural and legal persons, are typically excluded from this particular process. So this is a procedure or judicial mechanism that's already been used because the European Commission also kickstarted an arbitration process against the UK for its decision relating to its decision to unilaterally extend the grace period, and in particular, it's arguing that the manner in which this has been done is a violation of the good faith requirement in the withdrawal agreement. Next to that, you have, of course, the fact that the protocol requires that the UK, at least with respect to Northern Ireland, continues to comply with a raft of EU legislation, right? EU internal market law on goods, on customs, EU rules on state aid and VAT. And for those rules, they continue to produce the same legal effect that they did when the UK was a new member state. So they have direct effect, which means that individuals can invoke the rights derived from these EU laws directly before domestic courts and tribunals, for example, here in Northern Ireland. And of course, those courts and tribunals can then refer questions concerning the validity of measures in light of EU law or validity of EU acts directly before the Court of Justice. So that's another form of judicial review mechanism. And you have the enforcement action, which I'll deal with in the next slide. And then next to that, of course, you have domestic judicial review mechanisms. There are various mechanisms in the EU legal system, from the preliminary reference procedures, annulment actions, enforcement actions. And again, you have the UK judicial review mechanisms, which I'll deal with next. If we can just move the slides. Thank you. Right, so first of all, I wanted to deal with enforcement action or infringement procedures, right? Because this is something that is very relevant right now. Last month, the European Commission decided to initiate infringement proceedings against the UK for its decision to unilaterally extend the grace period. So enforcement actions it's a procedure which allows the European Commission to challenge the legality of acts adopted by a new member state. And in this case, in the context of the protocol, that would be the UK. It's subdivided into two stages. You have the pre-litigation stage, which is essentially intended to create an environment or scenario where the member state complies with EU law of its own volition, to provide it with the opportunity to comply with EU law of its own volition. And then if that doesn't work, you move on to the next stage, which is the judicial stage. So what we saw last month was the European Commission kickstarting the pre-litigation stage by issuing a letter of formal notice to the UK, a very brief letter, briefly outlining the nature of the breach of EU law, and also providing a time period within which the UK should respond to those allegations. And it's not uncommon for the UK to, for the European Commission to engage in discussions with the member state which is alleged to be in breach of EU law and try and find a solution during this period. If the European Commission is then not satisfied with the response it has received from the UK, it can then move on to the next stage, which would be to formulate a reasoned opinion. So a much more detailed explanation of the nature of the breach, the provisions that are being breached, and also in some cases, some suggestions in terms of how you can ensure compliance with EU law. The reasoned opinion also has to mention a reasonable period of time in which you have to ensure compliance. So the objective of the reasoned opinion is either to give that member state all the information it needs in order to ensure compliance, or if the country, in this case the UK, believes that it is acting in compliance with EU law, then it gives it all the information it needs in order to start preparing its defense in anticipation of a potential dispute before the Court of Justice. What happens if after the reasonable period of time, the Commission is still not convinced that the UK is complying with EU law? Then it has a decision to make, right? Because the European Commission has a discretionary power to decide whether or not to take this to the next stage. So it's perfectly possible that in a few months' time, even if the UK has not removed the grace period, that European Commission will decide not to take this forward, right? For a number of reasons, let's say, because of, the politically unstable situation here in Northern Ireland, or simply because it's not really considered to be, the best time to bring the UK before the Court of Justice. If the European Commission does decide to take this forward, then what will happen is that the Court of Justice will be asked to issue a judgment, which is declaratory in nature. So the idea here is that the Court of Justice will have to declare one way or another whether there has been a breach of EU law. There's no question here of imposing financial sanctions at this stage or awarding damages or compensation, right? So financial sanctions happen later on. So the legal effect of this judgment is to require the UK to comply with EU law if there is an illegality. And it has to do this within a reasonable period of time. If that doesn't happen, then the European Commission can decide to reach out to the court and ask it to apply financial sanctions. But before that, it has to issue a new reasoned opinion, again, outlining why the UK has failed to comply with the judgment, and again, giving it a reasonable period of time to comply with the judgment. Have I already run out of time here, David?
No, keep going.
Okay, right. And so if after that reasonable period of time, there is still no compliance with the judgment, then the European Commission can ask the court to impose financial sanctions, which can come in the form of daily penalties and or lump sum amount, which is a much greater amount. So usually what will happen is the Commission will ask for both to be applied in combination. So first of all, you pay daily penalties, and the daily penalties are intended to create an incentive to comply with the judgment. And after a prolonged period of non-compliance, then you impose a lump sum, which is a much greater amount. Now, the key issue here is, of course, well, what happens if the UK simply decides not to pay up? There's very little, right, the European Commission can do to force it to pay these financial sanctions. With respect to UK judicial review, again, the broad consensus here is that the protocol was incorporated into UK law as a result of Section 7A of the EU Withdrawal Act, and therefore it is subject to judicial review analysis under UK law. And we've seen a number of these judicial review applications spring up in the past few months, which is not surprising because the UK adopts a very liberal approach to standing requirements. very relaxed approach to standing requirements, where it's fairly easy to justify standing before a court of law with respect to judicial review. So what can you challenge? You can challenge acts, right? We've seen challenges leveled at the Northern Ireland Protocol itself in light of constitutional statutes. So the challenge from unionist parties argued that there's been a violation of several acts, acts of the Union, the Northern Ireland Act. And we've seen also challenges from business representatives who argued that there's been a violation of the Human Rights Act. You can also challenge an omission, so a failure to act. So just a hypothetical example, and I'm not trying to give anyone any ideas here, but let's say, for example, that a domestic interest group in Northern Ireland were to formally request the UK to trigger Article 16 of the protocol, right? The safeguards clause, the infamous safeguards clause. So ask the UK government to suspend some parts of the protocol on the basis of Article 16. And the answer to that request would be a negative one. So that, to decline that invitation to suspend the protocol. Now that refusal to act might in itself be sufficient basis for a judicial review. So we're not talking about just challenging positive acts, whether it be the protocol or acts implementing the protocol, like the decision to extend, to unilaterally extend the grace period. We're also talking about omissions. You can challenge, the grounds can be that of illegality, either because a measure fails to comply with the protocol, or procedural irregularity. So again, hypothetically, if the UK were to decide to adopt safeguard measures under Article 16, it would have to first consult with the EU. That's a specific procedural requirement in Article 16 and Annex 7 of the protocol. If it fails to do that, that would be also something that could be grounds for judicial review. Now, in terms of the remedies, there are multiple remedies. The most obvious ones would be in order to force an action, to compel the authorities, the UK government or other public authorities to act in a certain way to comply with the protocol, or in order to remove an act. And of course, there is the possibility of awarding damages to private applicants who can show that they've been adversely affected by that illegality. But I'll leave it there. Obviously, there's a lot I haven't covered, in particular EU judicial review, but if there are any questions on this, I'm more than happy to fill them up. I'll leave it there now. Thank you.
Hey. Thanks very much, Billy. I'm going to pass on to Katie and to Claire. Lisa.
Thank you very much, David, and hello, everybody. So I'm delighted to be able to present today some quantitative data from a Lucid Talk poll that was carried out for us for the project that David is leading on, that he mentioned at the beginning. And this is the first of 9 surveys that will be done as part of this project. And we will be conducting them every 4 months or so. And I should mention that basically this is using the Lucid Talk opinion poll panel. So it's online polling data. The results, we had a sample, a final sample of just over 2,100. And the results that we're presenting today are weighted to be representative of the Northern Ireland adult population. It's different from polling such as the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, that's random sampling. So it's worth bearing in mind that the respondents to this poll are people who are generally sort of interested and engaged in politics and current affairs in Northern Ireland. And this is possibly reflected in the results and possibly reflected in the fact that when we asked people about their understanding of the protocol, 57% of our respondents here said that they had a good understanding of it. I'm presuming some of them attend our post-Brexit clinics, and that would be great if they do. But notably too, only 7% said that there's reliable information available on the protocol. So we hope we're contributing something positive in that regard. So I'm just going to present to you the quantitative data from 4 of the 6 questions that we asked. And then Lisa will talk about the qualitative comments that we were asking people for. which is also a really fascinating part of this survey. I should mention too that this poll was conducted between the 24th and 28th of March, so before the recent unrest, but certainly at a time when the protocol seemed a rather live issue, was generating a lot of coverage as a topic in phone-in shows, etc. So basically, the way I'm presenting this data is agree minus all disagree. So basically, we presented a set of statements to begin with around the protocol on Brexit. I'm presenting some of these topics here. And basically, I'm just presenting here, as I say, the agree minus disagree, hence the negative results and some of them. And that's just a good indication, a sort of a fairly simple way of presenting fairly slightly complex data. So notably, the majority of people are saying that they don't think Brexit is a good thing for the UK. Unsurprisingly, we sort of see the split there continuing on since the Brexit referendum. And another notable thing is that most people agreed that particular arrangements are necessary for Northern Ireland arising out of Brexit. So overall, there was almost 2/3 of people who said that they agreed that that was true. Obviously, they're counterbalanced by those who had strong opinions saying that they didn't think that was the case. However, when we came on to asking them about the protocol itself, there we see things much more evenly split. And essentially almost coming to then the margin of error here. One interesting thing is that there are a very small percentage of people who were neutral on the topic or who said they don't know. So we see that people are quite strong, have strong opinions on the topic. And on this particular question about the appropriateness of the protocol or whether it's overall a good thing or not, as I say, people are quite evenly split on that matter. Interestingly, despite all of that, overall, there was a majority of people saying that they thought the protocol did offer economic opportunities for Northern Ireland. Next slide, please, David. The next question is in relation to, we asked people to assess the current impact of the protocol. So bearing in mind, this was to try and measure how things seemed in the first quarter of the operation of the protocol. A lot seemed to be happening at the time. And we see here, again, this is the overall positive view minus the overall negative view. Notably, all of these assessments are in the negative. And most particularly, people's views were that the politics of the matter were most negative. Now, as with all quantitative data, you'd always be thinking about the question that was asked and all the assessments and judgments people have to make in answering these questions. I'm very aware of this as somebody who uses this type of data. And the question we asked was very vague. It was, what do you think about the current impact of the protocol in relation to politics in Northern Ireland? So there's a lot of interpretation going on there, and Lisa may say a wee bit about that in the comments as well. But you see here, the very clear majority of people felt that it was having a negative impact on politics in Northern Ireland. Again, we're not asking as to the reason why. That may be something to do with Brexit, might be something to do with the nature of the protocol itself. You see here two concerns overall about Northern Ireland's place vis-a-vis GB, strong concerns in some quarters about its constitutional place, others in relation to its place in the UK internal market, which of course has changed as a result of the protocol. Also a negative impact on the view that it's seen as having a negative impact on UK-EU relations and on British-Irish relations. We asked specifically about the protocol, but again, people's views of Brexit are brought into this assessment as well. More variety and more sort of positive views were considered when it came to its impact on the Good Friday Agreement in relation to Northern Ireland's economy and on North-South cooperation, but overall the views were negative. The only one where it was just about balanced was about Northern Ireland's position in the world. Next slide, please. So people have concerns about the protocol. They have worries about its impact on politics and Northern Ireland's relationship with GB. When it comes to people's assessment of how the protocol is being handled, most particularly how Northern Ireland's interests are being represented, we see grave causes for concern here, I think. most notably, we see just quite how much people actively distrust some of the key actors here. So again, this is presenting the levels of trust, including trust a lot, minus those who are saying that they distrust. So for the UK government, we had 5% of people saying that they trust the UK government. 1% of those were saying that they trust the UK government a lot, but 86% were saying that they distrusted the UK government. Whitehall civil servants also had received low levels of trust, of around 6% saying that they trusted them. For the Northern Ireland Assembly and Northern Ireland Executive, again, those findings are quite negative, with 63% of people saying that they distrust the Northern Ireland Executive. For the UK-EU Joint Committee and for the Irish government, we see a slightly different pattern here. This is mainly because there were some people who, a larger proportion of people who saying they actively trusted them, and also we had larger, and for the Irish government, there were fewer people who said they were neutral on the matter, possibly unsurprising. So again, people's overall political preferences possibly feeding into that. But the overall picture is one in which we would have concern, I think all of us could as Democrats, about the strong levels of distrust in all of these actors, with one notable exception, and that is that 52% of people said they trusted Northern Ireland business representatives to handle Northern Ireland's interests vis-a-vis the protocol, which is a really interesting finding. Only about a quarter of people said they distrusted them. And this is interesting because, of course, we know that Frost and Shefkovich have both said that they want to reach out to business and civic groups and other stakeholders directly in Northern Ireland in the coming few weeks. Last slide, please. So as David's already mentioned, we have this consent vote that's taking place in the Northern Ireland Assembly by the end of 2024. We asked people slightly more nuanced questions than those that were asked in the BBC Spotlight poll. Essentially, what the overall finding is that it's within the margin of error as to whether people are wanting to see the protocol being voted on negatively or in favour. So essentially, 47% of people were saying that they would vote for a candidate who would want to see the protocol remaining in full, and 42% said that they would vote for a candidate who would want to see Articles 5 to 10 being disapplied. Those who said they had no interest or didn't know were only 11%. So again, you see how much of a live topic this is. Then we were asking then about the Assembly elections next year and how their views around that consent vote will affect their votes in 2022. And we see here 42% say that they'll only vote for candidates who are in favour of continued application of the protocol. And then we have 39% saying that they would vote, they want to see people voting against that. And you can see here, even though it's not going to be an option in that vote, 26% of people saying they only want to vote for candidates who are taking a really hard line on it and want the entire protocol to be scrapped. We did ask other questions around certain topical issues, and I'll just mention one because David mentioned it at the beginning there, and that is in relation to regulatory alignment. So we asked people as to whether they would like to see the UK align with the EU in order to reduce checks and controls on the Irish Sea border, and 57% said they wanted to see the UK align, but notably 34% said they didn't. So again, we see very strong views, pro-Brexit views reflected in the answers to those questions. And I'll hand over to Lisa now. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. All here okay, yeah. So yeah, apologies for a slightly heavier text slide. As Katie mentioned, one of the questions on the poll allowed for open-ended comments, either on the survey or the topics covered in it. So we received 511 substantive responses to that, 453 of which related directly to the subject matter, so the protocol and Northern Ireland politics generally. So what you see on the screen is a summary of the themes that come through in those comments in descending order of frequency. Should just make clear that the comment section was optional. So unlike the quantitative responses, this aspect of the poll wasn't representative. However, given that we did receive over 450 detailed replies relating to the subject and the protocol and aspects of it, the comments do add some useful nuance and colour that help contextualize our quantitative findings. So I'll not go through all of the whole list in detail, but just say a few things about the perspectives that come through. So as you see there, the most common theme is the idea of the protocol as necessary and or beneficial. There's some variation in that I'll talk about in the next slide. This was followed then by comments that were critical of unionist politicians in general or the DUP in particular. And that criticism tended to have two kinds of focuses, either on their role in the Brexit process or more recent actions regarding strong opposition to the protocol. So the third most common theme then was just to characterise Brexit as, in negative terms, as a mess or a disaster or folly, similar such adjectives in the similar theme. Then the fourth aspect reflects those findings around trust, or rather distrust. As we see quite strong criticism of the UK government coming through in people's perspectives. And then final, just to mention on this slide that those next two most common themes are quite similar. Calls for the protocol to be scrapped and or respondents who expressed really strong and unqualified negative views of the protocol. And they were tended to be expressed in strong terms, and were also linked to the idea of the protocol as being contrary to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and or the perception that the EU or Irish government had been using Northern Ireland in the context of Brexit. All of that relates back to what Billy was talking about in terms of judicial review, and also just what comes through in the quantitative findings, as Katie mentioned, that there is that 26% in that final slide pie chart that shows a group that very strongly have very strong opposing views to the protocol. Okay, next slide, thanks. Just to quickly add a bit more detail and colour to three of the themes. So the first around criticism of the UK government, to say that tended to have two angles or focuses. First, to be critical of the type of Brexit that the government pursued and achieved through the deal. And second, related to a perceived disregard or disregard for Northern Ireland in the context of Brexit. And that theme is then linked to a sense of lack of Northern Ireland, adequate Northern Ireland representation going forward, which is relevant to the project, of course, and also information, reliable information available. So the example quotation on the screen exemplifies those two kind of sub-themes within that, that the UK government negotiated a bad deal and sent a signal that Northern Ireland doesn't matter. Second aspect then, and I would suggest this perhaps the most important dynamic that comes through from the qualitative findings within that largest section of that view the protocol as necessary. There is a broad variation from those who think of the protocol or describe the protocol in positive terms entirely. Others who would suggest that it is potentially positive if it's implemented well, and then those who describe it as negative, but a necessary mitigation to alleviate the negative impacts of Brexit, which tended to be viewed in very negative light. Okay, yes, and the examples there demonstrate those two types. So the protocol is a good thing if it's implemented correctly, and then Brexit as a disaster, but the protocol as a necessary mitigation to that. Final aspect, just to say, reiterates points already made, just to note that echoing the quantitative findings, those who we do see a strong polarization, and those who have an unequivocal negative view of the protocol tended to express that in very strong terms. And as noted on the slide, tended to link that, perceive that negative impact or potential negative impact to be multifaceted, not just around political stability or instability, but also economic, social and constitutional, as the quotations on the screen suggest. Perhaps just in closing then, while we do find strong polarization in views of the protocol, there is perhaps something to be said around consensus of a shared concern about its potential negative impact across multiple areas, albeit with very different views about the extent to which that impact can or ought to be managed. Yeah, and speaking of managing, I will hand over to Vivian to talk about a particular type in agri-food, if that's okay.
Thanks very much, Lisa.
Okay,
over to you, Vivian.
Yes.
I say while we're working through this, if people want to put any questions into the chat, please don't hesitate to do so, because we've obviously got to have time after Vivian's spoken to pick up on some of the issues which have been raised so far. Anyway, Vivian, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. So as part of the polling that David, Katie, Billy and Lisa have been up to, there's been discussion around alignment between the UK and the EU, and especially for Northern Ireland, with what would alignment for GB look like if GB were to align with the EU on food standards, how that would actually help a lot with managing the protocol and managing the checks that we have to do. So David, if you can just move to the next slide. So there's actually an error on that slide. I noticed that box comes from an Institute for Government report in 2020, not 2018, but the box itself still works. It's just the idea that we talk a lot about SPS, and I just wanted to make sure that everyone was on board about exactly what it means, so sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And they cover a lot of different aspects. So, just rules around animal and plant life, but also issues that we've heard so much for years now about, wooden crates and pallets and whether they're treated some way or not. That's also under SPS. So these are very, really quite wide-ranging type of rules. When we were having our last Brexit clinic back in February, just before then, there'd been kind of discussion and by kind of business groups saying, that there were things that 5 Ps identified as being really key issues when it came to actually delivering on the protocol. And these are quite linked with SPS. So you've got your pets, you've got your plants, you've got your seed potatoes, plant products, and there's all of these rules. And so a lot of the checks that are supposed to happen in the Irish sea border are actually to do with SPS. And so the discussion then is, of course, because currently the island of Ireland as a whole follows EU SPS rules, whereas GB doesn't. And so when we are actually talking about changing the position of the UK government on SPS, what we are talking about is actually changing the rules for GB. It wouldn't change actually the rules for Northern Ireland that much. It is really about changing the rule for GB. And so in many ways, it would alleviate some of the key problems with delivering on the protocol here, but it would actually also make food producers and agri-food producers in GB their life much easier. And this is what we're seeing with, we keep on hearing about lots of different small SMEs in the food sector is really struggling to export to the EU single market if they're based in GB. And so I think it's really important to think that, of course, I mean, being based in Northern Ireland, we think about, you know, what is happening in Northern Ireland with Brexit. But it's really important to remember that actually a lot of the potential solutions to the issues that we are having in Northern Ireland would also have major benefits for small businesses in GB that are currently not being able to export or facing very high obstacles, you know, non-tariff barriers to sell to the EU market. And we're seeing even today there's reports of new, you know, this the new EU rules entering into force around, you know, additional veterinary checks needed on products, on, you know, on kind of what's called, you know, mixed products with composite multi-ingredient products, so sandwiches, pizza, salads, and all of that being exported from third countries into the EU single market. So that's important to see that these SPS questions are not static as well. The EU will keep on changing its rules on these issues. And so the problems, the barriers we have today may actually grow in the future. So if you want to move, please, to the next slide, David. So what are the options then? SPS is a big issue for everyone wanting to trade with the EU internal market. The internal market being one of the biggest and richest markets, you know, it is definitely a market that people are trying to trade into. And so there's been lots of agreements and deals made to ease the trade in food and agri-food product. There's basically two overall options, so like, well, three. One is not having any kind of agreement. The second one would be to negotiate some kind of equivalence. And the third is an alignment. And alignment is what we've been talking a lot around, you know, potential alignment GB to EU as a solution. But I think it's really important to realize why we're talking about alignment and not just equivalence. So in terms of a country that the EU has some equivalence agreement on for veterinary issues, you have some agreement with USA. You had one with Canada that has now been subsumed under the much broader EU-Canada free trade agreement. You also have one with New Zealand. These are rule by rule agreement. You know, so equivalence will really differ country to, like, each agreement will differ in terms of the scope and ambition. About you know, what actual rules are being covered. And we're seeing, for example, that in general, there's been a very narrow understanding of equivalence that has been used. So as in, it's not just about, you know, just because food may be considered safe at the end of the production system and may be considered equivalently safe, that doesn't mean actually that there is equivalence for the whole process. I mean, as we know, with all the, you know, never-ending debates around chlorinated chickens, for example, the EU does not recognize that kind of process as equivalent to the way that we grow chicken in the EU. So there's been quite a narrow understanding of equivalence and quite a politicization as well of equivalence, with, for example, the EU-US equivalent veterinary agreement being very bad, like very poorly used, and with very few rules actually being considered equivalent. Much more exchanges and like good working relation between the EU and New Zealand, but of course New Zealand doesn't think it goes far enough, and that's why there's also discussion of really moving to a much bigger agreement. It is normally reciprocal, as in, you know, you can have equivalence goes both ways and cover trades in both directions. Also, there's been some exceptions. So, for example, you know, during monuments of you know, during the BSE crisis, or, you know, foot and mouth disease and all that, where you would have New Zealand sheep that were considered safe to come into the EU, but not the other way around. And this critically does not mean absence of checks. You do have, each party can do spot checks to check that the others are actually committed, actually delivering on what they committed to. You can have an agreement on the frequency of checks, And in the end, you end up checking against domestic rules that have been considered equivalent. So you're checking against domestic rules and not against export market rules. So it is perhaps easier to check, but you still have lots of checks. The proposal that has been looked at more is alignment. And we know, I mean, this has been discussed for years. A lot of it was discussed, I mean, that's the reason why we have this alignment between Northern Ireland and the EU on these issues, is that it allows the absence of most SPS checks at on the Irish border, right? So this is not a new issue. The question is like whether you then also include GB in that. So the key example for this is the Swiss-EU veterinary agreement. So Switzerland keeps pace with EU regulatory development on SPS. It's not as with an equivalence where if one, where they have to keep equivalence to each other. It's really the EU sets the rules and then Switzerland has to update its own rules to match with what the EU has agreed. So you are not on a kind of peer-to-peer basis here. You do have a Swiss presence in Brussels to try to influence the EU regulatory process. And, Switzerland has a very long tradition of doing that. But that does mean, but Switzerland does not vote, of course, on the SPS rules. You do have now a common EU-Swiss veterinary area. There hasn't been veterinary control for trade in animals and animal products between Switzerland and the EU since 2009. And border inspection posts, EU border inspection posts will check shipments from third countries going both into the EU and into Switzerland and vice versa. That means, you can have, US companies or the UK kind of just like having all their products enter the EU plus Switzerland area in just one port of entry and then traveling freely within that. And you do have some very limited divergence that remains possible. So for example, Switzerland has managed to negotiate that they would, after the EU lost World Trade Organization arbitration, on hormone-treated US beef. Switzerland can still import some hormone-treated US beef, even though that is not acceptable like for sale in the EU. So these are basically the two kind of options to go forward. And because of the huge amount of politicization that we've seen with equivalence, that actually there's been very limited benefits in cases such as the US and Canada, and though it does work a bit better with New Zealand, definitely the complete alignment, the Swiss model would make much more sense. We do know that does mean that, having to follow EU SPS rules. Now, on the other hand, of course, these EU SPS rules were, of course, co-produced with the UK government. Even that latest rule will have been voted while you still had UK MEPs. You still have, so we have these are not these we have in many ways to kind of reclaim ownership of these rules. These are rules that were also decided with the UK around the table. So we're actually in a much better position than Switzerland that accepts these rules without having had any kind of formal input in their creation. And in general, we have to see that these kind of agreement, in many ways, some people are opposed to these because it would reduce the amount of, possibility to strike trade deals with big economies. We know, for example, Switzerland definitely has an independent trade policy, and it is not particularly constrained by having that alignment. And in any case, we could always revisit having such an alignment if we were, if at the, when we are actually negotiating these deals and deciding that perhaps having greater access to the US market is worth having much reduced access to the EU market. But for now, we're not in a position that we could have that greater access to the US market. So having an alignment, even if temporary, would definitely ease the situation. And that's all for me.
Okay, thanks ever so much, Vivian, for that. Okay, over to attendees for questions. I see we've had a number come through on the chat. I don't know if colleagues have had a chance to have a look to see what's been put forward there, but I noticed there's quite a few questions there about SPS. Vivian, I'm wondering if you want to come in on any of those. John Pete asks, so given what Vivian says about SPS alignment or an New Zealand-Swiss deal, what argument other than ideology is there for not doing this? If it is to get a US trade deal that is not convincing, as no such deal is on offer anyway, it certainly won't be in there if there are more rows over the Northern Ireland Protocol. Is it all ideology?
You know, ideology, red lines, you know, you can call it different ways. I think there's a very strong position on not having any oversight of EU institutions. And that has been kind of a red line throughout. I think in many ways you do have this idea that it's really important to be able to be more open on the agri-food front than the EU was. That perhaps one way of striking better trade deals is being able to put much more the agri-food market in competition with third parties. Now, whether that would actually be appreciated by the farming community in the UK or by agri-food producers, that is unlikely. But I mean, that's been kind of I think the starting point for many people in government has been that you know, the farming community is weaker politically in the UK than overall in the EU, and they can get away with much more than the EU could. And that's one of the rare area where that's the case. So they're unwilling really to actually let go of that. Now, the US one is an interesting one because you do have a completely incoherent US position on that, because you have on the one hand, we must defend the Good Friday Agreement and the protocol at all cost. And on the other hand, we must allow, you know, we must have the UK break free from EU food like SPS rules at all cost. And you can't have both. So, you know, if you end up trying to get, you know, the more US products that don't meet EU rules you would have in GB, the more then you'd have to have checks on the Irish border to make sure that these products don't enter the EU internal market via the Northern Ireland backdoor. So in many ways, that contradiction between perhaps the, you know, Irish Senate, you know, and the kind of, I guess, Iowa caucus kind of position there in the US hasn't been dealt with. But I mean, they haven't had to, you know, actually make their choice on which one they would favor. And if the UK was to sign to align that, they would actually remove that question from the table. And I don't think they are really willing to do that yet. Dagmar has another question here, which is on whether these are actually connected. And you know, the SPS agreement between Switzerland and the EU is part of a lot of package agreement, and that when we saw, for example, that when Switzerland, you know, was pushing back against freedom of movement, that the Commission retaliated as well by stopping Erasmus, for example, between the EU and Switzerland. So there is connections between these different agreements, and so whether the EU would be open to the idea of an SPS agreement, I think that's a really good point. I think, you know, in many ways we're talking about trying to convince the UK government that it is worth doing, but that doesn't mean that the EU would necessarily want to offer such agreement. I think in many ways it would make things much simpler. So I think there may be appetite in the EU to accept it, but that would be definitely, I think, would have to be sold as making things easier for Northern Ireland and not making things easier for GB producers to export to the EU, in order of getting that, again, that very often repeated wish to be flexible for Northern Ireland, but not for the UK as a whole.
Okay. Yeah, I think certainly what we're hearing coming out of the discussions between the UK and the EU is that the EU has made an offer to discuss regulatory alignment, but there's quite considerable pushback on the UK side on this. I think we're going to have to see how that plays out. Okay. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on SPS.
I think just actually to come back
Cool.
on regulatory alignment, I think there's a question on whether the EU would only would accept regulatory alignment on only SPS, or would use that discussion to say, okay, in that case, labor rights, environmental standards, we can't just have one of these without the others. And that would be a tougher discussion, even more tough for the UK government.
Okay, all right. Let's see, Michael Darcy, you have your hand raised. Do you want to come in with a question? Can we unmute Michael? Perhaps.
Okay, now I'm
Go ahead, Michael.
Yay, thank you very much for unmuting me. So I want to pick up the SPS and then just make a wider point. The SPS, after all, underpins the single epidemiological area that is the island of Ireland, okay? And that underpins the all-island economy in agri-food and agri-food production. And currently, I just got an update from the dairy industry yesterday, for example. The dairy industry, north and south combined, is on target to meet its production target of 11 billion gallons this year, worth an estimated 3.2 billion in international sales. Now, that's built around a regulatory gold standard that's shared on the island. And it seems to me it's unfortunate that we're not having any dimension of that aspect of what the protocol is doing for Northern Ireland in this debate. And particularly around SPS that, as you said at the outset, has got things that are related to the consumer side of the economy, as in pet food and other such things, and not at all on the productive side of the economy. And it's a real, I mean, going back to the poll that you've done and the findings, looked at from a Dublin perspective in an all-island context, rather than having a debate balanced by looking at both worlds, the debate is taking place entirely looking at only one world, which is the whole GB-NI relationship. And the SPS is a kind of contradiction there as well, because as you were highlighting, if you've UK regulatory alignment, then you undermine what Northern Ireland has in terms of the best of both worlds in agri-food, because it is a higher standard of regulation to the rest of the UK, which is something that's of an asset in the global market and indeed in the single market. This issue is being conducted entirely in a kind of a relatively narrowly focused dimension that doesn't take enough account of that wider productive economy. And again, going back to the legal debate, I mean, again, businesses invest money, they expect stability, they expect predictability. To what extent do these legal challenges actually to the protocol upend the stability that is underpinning the continuation of those all-island economic chains, and as a consequence cause further damage to the Northern Ireland economy? It
So
seems
just perhaps just to, I'm sorry.
It need to be put on the table.
I think perhaps leaving Billy some time to prepare an answer on that one. I'd say just on the, a single epidemiological zone for the island of Ireland, that predates, that was already the case when the UK was a member. So you already had some checks, on live animals and all that. So just because you would have an agreement doesn't mean that, I think the agreement would be much more on agri-food than live animals crossing, for example. So it doesn't have to cover everything. And you would still have, it would still make sense, for having an all-island economy. But I think it's really important to consider that, yes, in some cases, it could be that, there's been huge restructuring in the dairy industry as well, to kind of to protect itself from the border, whichever way it was going to be raised. And that some of that, if we end up easing some of these barriers, some of these investment may have been, perhaps not useful in the end. And that's a difficult situation, because you end up having, some businesses that didn't have the budget to adapt, that would really benefit from easing off the current barriers. But of course, the budgets that did completely reconfigure their operation system would end up losing. So there's definitely going to be pros and cons whichever decision is made. But I think in any case, the idea is what the point you're making around the lack of the need to consider definitely the north-south dimension and the lack of business, like certainty for business. I mean, that's been an issue throughout the whole process. And the fact is, things that even though we now have these treaties, I don't think we yet have business certainty. And we may not have much business certainty for at least some time still, which is definitely not an ideal situation.
Okay, thanks, Vivian. Billy?
Yes, thank you for that question. I'm not sure I'm entirely qualified to answer it. What I would say is that, so do these judicial reviews lead to instability or economic instability? My sense, and this is based on purely just reading, in the media, is that Northern Irish businesses have been very good in adapting to the situation. And I'm not sure the judicial reviews are in any way affecting their work. Most of the instability has actually, in my opinion, resulted from the lack of preparation, transparency, and information from the government in terms of the operation of the protocol, if we're looking at it from an economic perspective. These judicial review applications are essentially a consequence of the political instability, which is not necessarily a result of the protocol, but of Brexit itself. And they will continue to be in place as long as that political instability persists.
Okay, thanks, Billy. Katie, a couple of comments there from Michael Coyle and Dagmar. Welcome, Dagmar. If people are wondering why Dagmar's asking questions, not part of the presentation here, Dagmar moved to University College Cork at the end of last year, so he's no longer with us at Queen's, but I'm sure we'll get her back at some point in the future. Katie.
Yes, so I think so the questions around not covering all 27 member states. I mean, this is the thing in a survey, right? You need to keep it as straightforward as possible. And already we were getting the complaints about the complexity of the questions and the number. And I'm fully aware that the more complex a survey gets, the more unreliable the data in some ways. So basically, the question we were asking about trust as key actors. The individual member states may well play their part, but we're not going to make the same mistake as the British government in trying to differentiate too much between different member states in terms of their influence on Northern Ireland. The thing that matters is the UK-EU Joint Committee, and we asked specifically about that. And for obvious reasons, not least of which is the Belfast Agreement, but also the fact that, of course, Ireland is still a member state and does play a more significant role for Northern Ireland vis-a-vis in relation to the EU than any other member state. We asked about the Irish government as well. So hence those choice of questions, which is probably quite straightforward and obvious. David, did you want to say a wee bit more about the project and what that might cover in terms of informing people around the various dynamics of it all?
Okay, I think, obviously we're focusing at the moment on the opinion poll and the report that we've issued, and I see Kevin's, I think, sent around a link to it. But there's various other dimensions to the project as well, which includes an ongoing monitoring of the activities of the various UK-EU bodies involved in its implementation, but also the various national bodies, domestic bodies, which are involved in scrutinising the outputs of the process, but also the inputs as well. So how is, for example, Northern Ireland executive engaging in the process? We want to come to that, and we'll be writing various analyses on that in due course, all of which will be on the website that I flagged at the beginning of the session today. We're obviously very keen in the various sets of dynamics. And I suppose one just to pick up on, which I think is alluded to in what Michael and Dagmar have said there, is that normally a relationship between the EU and a third country, certainly in terms of the implementation of the agreement, rests with the Commission and the implementation. What's really interesting about the UK-EU relationship and the operation of the protocol at the moment is the extent to which the member states are really playing quite a key role and acting as a constraint in some respects on what the Commission is actually able to do. They seem to have a far more hands-on, engaged approach, such that each of the recent meetings of the specialised committee that they've attended, and often in numbers, which is quite unusual in EU external relations. And I think it's also a point which is often not picked up about the trade and cooperation agreement, is that that's not going to be the UK just talking to the European Commission. That's going to be the UK talking to the European Commission and the member states. They will be attending meetings of the key body there. So I suppose just coming back to the project, one of the things we're trying to do is respond flexibly to the developments within the protocol and the dynamics that emerge, and ensure that the analyses that we pull together are going to reflect those dynamics. What we're also interested in looking at is not just the operation of the protocol in the context of Northern Ireland, but also how does this relationship compare to other relationships which the EU has with third parties, and the dynamics which underpin the governance and operation of those as well. So yeah, one of the good things about an event like this is we can pick up ideas which people are putting forward about what we might be looking at as well. And going back to the public opinion, yes, we want to ensure that over the course of the 9 polls that we'll be operating, we're essentially asking the same, if not very, very similar questions. But also we've got a space in there to be asking particularly topical questions, so that we can get a sense of how attitudes are developing, have evolved on a range of different issues. Hence the fact that this time around we asked about SPS. What we also asked about was whether people would actually welcome an EU office in Northern Ireland. Part of the argument being that, okay, if you're criticising the EU for being too remote and not understanding Northern Ireland, is there not value for having an EU presence on the ground in Northern Ireland? And I think I'm right in saying that we saw a majority in favour of having such an office, but nevertheless, as with the SPS question, quite a significant body of opposition to such an idea as well. Okay. All right. So we're running up against time, and I can't see any other questions coming through. Can I just therefore thank everybody for their presentations, to Katie, Lisa, Billy and Vivian. Obviously, thank everybody for attending. The plan is to continue running these post-Brexit clinics on a fairly regular basis. I expect we'll be back late May, possibly early June. By that time, we'll hopefully know what's happening in terms of UK-EU agreements on sorting out the rest of the implementation of the protocol. We might have a sense of where we are with the judicial review, certainly the domestic one. We might have a sense as to what's happening with the EU legal action. We'll see. We probably won't have our next poll done by then, but clearly, if you are interested in taking part in that poll will be run by Lucid Talk probably in late June, and we'll certainly be presenting the results at a future post-Brexit clinic, probably in the autumn. But in the meantime, there will be reports out. And if I can just encourage you, if you haven't already, is to note the link to the website. You'll get a sense there of what we're up to with the project, and also what we're managing to make available online. And if there are any feedback you have, that will be very much welcomed. So thanks very much, everybody. Katie.
Sorry, just one little thing. The Northern Ireland Life and Times survey from last year, the data is being launched on the 10th of June, and we're hoping for a dedicated session that afternoon or thereabouts, still to be confirmed, on the political modules that include stuff on Brexit. So just
okay, great. Well, we'll make sure everybody gets informed about that. So thanks. Okay, well, thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, Kevin, for organising things in the background, and we look forward to catching up with everybody again at the next clinic, probably sometime in June. Okay, thanks so much, everyone.